Imagine a New England winter so fierce, the earth itself becomes an iron vault, refusing the spade and the plough alike. In the late 19th century, the rolling hills of Rhode Island and Vermont were not merely landscapes of pastoral beauty, but theatres of a quiet, desperate war. Families huddled in drafty farmsteads, watching as a shadow moved from room to room. It was a thief that stole the breath. It was a hunger that hollowed out the chest. One by one, the young and the vibrant grew pale, their skin turning to translucent parchment, their eyes bright with a terrifying, unnatural fire. When the churchyards finally claimed them, the horror did not end. It only deepened. Neighbours whispered over stone walls about the dead who would not stay dead. They spoke of a contagion, not of the air, but of the spirit. They believed that those resting beneath the frost were reaching back through the soil to drain the life from those they once loved. To stop the dying, the living had to do the unthinkable. They had to take up the shovel. They had to open the caskets. They had to look into the faces of their own children and find the monster within. This is not a ghost story. This is the documented history of the Great New England Vampire Panic. The air in the bedroom is thick with the smell of pine smoke and metallic rot. A young woman lies beneath a heavy wool shroud, her chest heaving with a labour that yields no rest. Each breath is a ragged whistle. Suddenly, a fit of coughing shatters the silence. She presses a white lace handkerchief to her lips, and when she pulls it away, it is blooming with a vivid, terrifying crimson. This is the red flower of the 19th century. This is the mark of the wasting death. To understand the panic that gripped the rugged farmsteads of the Northeast, one must first understand the predator that stalked them. Long before the word virus or bacterium held any meaning for the common man, there was consumption. It was the leading cause of death in the eastern United States, a slow-motion pandemic that accounted for nearly 1 out of every 4 funerals. Today, we call it tuberculosis. But to the families of the 1800s, it was an enigma. It was a curse that seemed to select the most beautiful, the most diligent, and the most vital among them, consuming their flesh until they were little more than walking skeletons. The physical transformation was nothing short of macabre. As the lungs were destroyed from within, the body's fat and muscle simply evaporated. The skin became a ghostly, waxy white. Because the fever burned so hot, the cheeks would often take on a bright, hectic flush, a cruel parody of health that made the sufferer look vibrant even as they stood at the edge of the abyss. This waxy pallor, combined with the sunken, dark, ringed eyes, created a countenance that was unsettlingly similar to the folkloric descriptions of the undead. To an observer in a candlelit room, the sick did not look like patients. They looked like creatures transitioning into a different state of being. Science at the time was a flickering candle in a very dark room. Germ theory was still a decade or more away from reaching the isolated valleys of the hinterlands. Doctors spoke of bad air, of hereditary weakness, or of imbalanced humours. But their tonics and their bleedings were useless against the White Plague. When a father buried his wife, only to see his eldest son begin to cough blood weeks later, he did not see a chain of infection. He saw a sinister intent. He saw a family being hunted. The folk logic of the era was as grim as the landscape. It was believed that the first person in a household to die of consumption became a spectral parasite. This person was not a vampire in the Hollywood sense. They were not rising from the grave to bite necks in the moonlight. Instead, they were thought to be feeding on the vital organs of their surviving kin through a psychic or spiritual tether. They stayed in the ground, but their spirit remained hungry, pulling the life force out of the living to sustain their own lingering essence in the grave. This was a contagion of the soul. The social atmosphere was one of profound, claustrophobic dread. In towns like Exeter, Rhode Island, and Jewett City, Connecticut, the fear was as tangible as the winter fog. People looked at their neighbours with suspicion. Every cough heard through a shared wall was a death knell. Every pale child was a potential victim of a grandmother or a sister who had already been laid to rest. The desperation was absolute. When the traditional prayers failed and the doctor's poultices proved hollow, the people turned to the oldest law they knew, the law of the earth. In these small, tightly knit communities, the oral tradition held the keys to survival. Tales brought over from the old world mingled with the harsh realities of the new world. They spoke of the undead or the living dead. While the word vampire was occasionally whispered in the ports and larger cities, in the rural heartland, the threat was far more intimate. It was simply the deceased relative who was not at rest. This belief was not born of malice or madness. It was born of love. It was the desperate attempt of a father to save his last living child by any means necessary, even if it meant desecrating the body of the child he had buried only a month before. The landscape itself played a role in fostering this superstition. New England is a land of rock and shadow. The soil is thin and filled with granite boulders, making every grave a hard-won victory over the earth. The winters are long, dark, and isolating. In the depths of January, when the sun hangs low and the wind howls through the leafless birches, the boundary between the living and the dead feels thin. In such an environment, the idea that a buried daughter could be reaching back for her brother does not seem like a fantasy. It seems like a cruel, natural fact. The medical science of the day inadvertently fueled these fires. Because physicians could not explain how the disease jumped from person to person, they often fell back on the idea of vulnerability. They noticed that the disease ran in families, leading many to believe it was an ancestral curse. When a doctor stood over a dying youth and shook his head in defeat, he was effectively handing the shovel to the family. He was admitting that the realm of medicine had ended and the realm of the extraordinary had begun. This was the invisible predator. It was a microscopic killer that looked like a ghost. It was a biological process that looked like a supernatural ritual. And as the death tolls mounted and the graveyards filled, the people of New England decided they would no longer be prey. They would go to the source of the hunger. They would go to the grave. We will walk into the shadows of the churchyard and witness the rituals of the heart. We will see what the living found when they dared to open the caskets of the recently departed, and how they attempted to kill a monster that was already dead. The frost is beginning to thaw, turning the churchyard soil into a heavy, sucking mire. In the flickering light of a dozen lanterns, the faces of the village elders are etched with a grim, hollow determination. They do not look like criminals. They look like men performing a holy, if horrific, duty. The sound of a spade hitting a wooden casket lid rings out like a gunshot in the frozen silence. This is the moment where grief meets the grotesque. This is the exhumation. When the families of New England reached the limit of their endurance, they turned to a set of rituals that were as specific as they were gruesome. They believed that if a family was being consumed by the dead, the only way to break the tether was to identify the living corpse and destroy its power. But what did they expect to find? They were looking for signs of life where there should only be decay, and in their desperation, they mistook the natural processes of death for the evidence of a monster. The first sign they sought was bloating. When a casket was pried open, the spectators often gasped to see a body that appeared fuller, more robust than it had been on the day of the funeral. To the villagers, this was clear proof. The deceased was gorging themselves on the blood of the living. They did not understand that as a body decomposes, the bacteria within produce gases. These gases have nowhere to go, causing the abdomen and limbs to swell, giving the corpse a mock vitality. In the cold New England earth, this process was often slowed, making the bloating look even more fresh and unnatural. Even more terrifying was the presence of liquid blood. In several documented cases, when the chest cavity was opened, the heart was found to be full of bright, fluid blood. To a farmer in 1800, this was the smoking gun. A dead person should be dry. Their blood should be clotted and black. If the heart held liquid red, it meant the spirit had just returned from a night of feeding. They could not know that the lungs, ravaged by consumption, often filled with fluid and blood that remained liquid long after the heart stopped beating. Furthermore, the extreme cold of the northern winters acted as a primitive refrigerator, preserving the blood in a state that looked deceptively alive. Then there were the hair and the nails. Families would cry out in horror to see that a daughter's hair seemed longer, or that her fingernails had grown into jagged claws since she was laid to rest. This was seen as a sign of continued growth, a physical manifestation of the undead state. The reality was more mundane, but no less macabre. As a body dehydrates after death, the skin and soft tissues shrink and retract. This retraction pulls back from the base of the hair and the cuticles of the nails, making them appear to have grown when, in fact, the body around them was simply receding. Once the vampire was identified, the ritual of execution began. The most common practice was the burning of the heart. The organ was carefully removed from the chest, a task that required a strong stomach and a sharp blade, and taken to a nearby flat rock. There, in front of the grieving family, the heart and often the liver were cast into a fire and reduced to ash. But the ritual did not end with the flames. In an act that blurs the line between folk magic and early vaccination, the ashes of the burned heart were often collected and mixed into a tonic of water or medicine. This grim concoction was then fed to the surviving family members who were currently suffering from the wasting death. They believed that by consuming the essence of the predator, the victim would gain the strength to fight off the spectral drain. It was a literal attempt to fight death with death. If burning the heart was considered too extreme, or if the community followed a different tradition, they might employ the practice of rearranging the bones. In the case of the Jewett City vampires in Connecticut, the Ray family exhumed several of their kin. Instead of burning the hearts, they decapitated the corpses and placed the skulls face down on the chest, or they flipped the entire body over within the coffin. The logic was simple. If the spirit tried to rise, it would be disoriented and dig deeper into the dark earth instead of upward toward the light of the living. These were not secret ceremonies conducted by cults in the woods. These were public events, often sanctioned by local officials and attended by the town's most respected citizens. In some instances, the local blacksmith or even a town doctor would be present to assist with the surgery. They saw it as a desperate form of public health, a final line of defense against a plague they could not name. The tragedy of these rituals lies in their futility. We have records of fathers who dug up 3, 4, or 5 of their children, burning each heart in turn, only to watch their last remaining heir die anyway. Each failure didn't lead them to doubt the existence of vampires. It only led them to believe they hadn't found the right one yet. The shovel stayed busy because the hunger of the disease was never ending. These rituals reveal a society at a breaking point. It was a culture caught between the old world of shadows and the new world of light, using the tools of the past to solve a problem that only the future could fix. They were trying to perform an exorcism on a bacterium, and in doing so, they created a landscape of opened graves and burned hearts that would haunt the American psyche for centuries to come. Next, we will focus our lens on the most famous victim of this panic, a young woman named Mercy Brown. Her story is the climax of the New England Terror, a case that made international headlines and may have provided the spark for the greatest vampire novel ever written. The month is March, 1892. The location is Exeter, Rhode Island, a town that would soon be whispered about in the drawing rooms of London and the medical halls of New York. The winter has been long and punishing, and for the Brown family, it has been a decade of mourning. George Brown, a hard-working farmer, has already seen the earth take his wife, Mary, and his eldest daughter, Mary Olive. Now, his son Edwin is failing. The boy, once strong, is now a shadow, his breath rattling like dry leaves in his throat. But the community's eyes are not on the living Edwin. They are fixed on the small stone receiving vault where 19-year-old Mercy Lena Brown has been resting since January. Mercy was the middle daughter, a girl known for her vitality before the wasting death claimed her. She had died only months prior, and because the ground was too frozen for a traditional burial, her casket sat in an above-ground stone structure, chilled by the relentless New England frost. To the neighbours of Exeter, this was not just a tragedy, it was a pattern. They approached George Brown with a horrific proposition. They told him that his family was being systematically hunted from the grave. They told him that if he wanted to save Edwin, he had to open the tombs. George Brown was a man of the modern age, or so he wished to be. He was sceptical. He resisted the pleas of his neighbours for weeks. But when you are a father watching your last son cough his life into a blood-stained sheet, scepticism is a luxury you cannot afford. Finally, he relented. On a grey, biting morning, a group of men, including a local physician, Dr. Harold Metcalf, approached the Brown family plot in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. They began with the mother and the eldest daughter. When the lids were pried back, the men found only what they expected from the long dead, grey bone and tattered shrouds. They were skeletons, dry and indifferent. But then, they moved to the stone vault. They moved to Mercy. When the heavy wooden lid of Mercy Brown's casket was lifted, A collective gasp escaped the men. Mercy did not look like the others. She was not a skeleton. Despite being dead for 9 weeks, her body was found turned slightly on its side. Her face, though pale, retained a haunting, lifelike fullness. Most terrifying of all, her lips and her heart were found to be flush with what appeared to be fresh, liquid blood. In that moment, the scientific presence of Dr. Metcalfe mattered little against the weight of ancient fear. To the witnesses, this was the living dead. This was the parasite that was stealing Edwin's breath. They did not account for the fact that Mercy had been kept in a natural refrigerator, the stone vault in a Rhode Island winter. They did not know that the blood in her heart remained liquid because the cold had halted the enzymes that would normally cause it to clot and blacken. They saw only a monster in the guise of a daughter. The ritual was swift and clinical. Following the established folk remedy of the region, the men removed Mercy's heart and her liver from her cold chest. They carried the organs to a nearby flat rock, a stone that still sits in that cemetery today, and built a fire. As the smell of wood smoke and charred flesh filled the winter air, the heart of Mercy Brown was reduced to a pile of grey cinders. But the desperation of George Brown went one step further. He took those ashes, the remains of his daughter's heart, and he stirred them into a glass of water. He took this grim medicine back to the farmstead and gave it to his dying son, Edwin. It was the ultimate sacrifice, a communion of the macabre. He believed that by ingesting the consumed heart of the vampire, Edwin would finally break the spell. History, however, is rarely as kind as folklore. Edwin Brown drank the ashes of his sister, but the vampire in his lungs was not a spirit that could be burned away. He died 2 months later, in May of 1892, joining Mercy, Mary Olive, and Mary in the family plot. The story of Mercy Brown did not die with Edwin. It was picked up by the Providence Journal and quickly spread across the Atlantic. It reached the ears of a stage manager for the Lyceum Theatre in London, a man named Bram Stoker. Stoker was at that moment meticulously researching a new novel about a nobleman from Transylvania. In his personal notes, researchers have found clippings of the Mercy Brown case. The parallels are striking. A beautiful young woman, dead but fresh in her tomb, whose heart must be dealt with to save the living. Mercy Brown, the girl from a small Rhode Island farm, had become the blueprint for the modern vampire. The case of Mercy Brown remains the high-water mark of the New England Panic. It was the moment when the ancient world and the modern world collided with devastating force. It was a testimony to the fact that even in the age of the telegraph and the steam engine, the human heart remains a dark and superstitious place when faced with the unknown. The laboratory is a stark contrast to the drafty farmhouses of Rhode Island. Here, the air does not smell of pine and wood smoke, but of carbolic acid and heated glass. In 1882, a full decade before the heart of Mercy Brown was cast into the flames, a German physician named Robert Koch sat hunched over a microscope in Berlin. He was hunting a ghost that had haunted humanity since the dawn of time. He was looking for the true face of the vampire. For centuries, the wasting death had been attributed to everything from divine wrath to spectral parasites. But beneath the lens of Koch's microscope, the monster finally lost its shadow. It was not a tall, pale nobleman in a velvet cloak. It was not a deceased sibling reaching out from a cold grave. It was a tiny, rod-shaped bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This discovery was a seismic shift in the history of human terror. Koch proved that the contagion was not a spiritual tether, but a biological one. It was carried on the breath. It lived in the droplets of a cough. It survived on the shared surfaces of a family home. When one person in a household fell ill, they were not feeding on their kin. They were simply and tragically infecting them. The reason the disease seemed to follow the lines of family and love was not because of a supernatural curse, but because of the intimacy of the home. Love was the delivery system for the predator. Yet, news travels slower than fear. While the scientific community celebrated Koch's Nobel-worthy breakthrough, the information trickled into the rural pockets of New England like water through granite. The farmers of Exeter and Jewett City did not read medical journals. They read the faces of their dying children. To them, a bacterium was an abstraction, a microscopic fairy tale that offered no comfort and no solution. A vampire, however, was something they understood. A vampire was something you could dig up. A vampire was something you could burn. The transition from superstition to germ theory was not a clean break. It was a long, painful overlapping of eras. Even after doctors began to explain the nature of the tubercle bacillus, many families continued to practice the old rituals in secret. They were hedging their bets. They would listen to the doctor's advice about fresh air and sanitariums, but they kept the shovel leaning against the back door just in case. They were caught in the twilight of the idols, where the old gods were dead, but the new ones hadn't quite learned how to save them. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the landscape of New England began to change. The isolated farmsteads were slowly connected by better roads and the reach of the State Board of Health. Education began to dismantle the folk logic that had governed the hills for generations. The vampire was replaced by the patient. The churchyard exhumations were replaced by the sanitarium. Large, airy institutions, built on hillsides where the sick were sent to take the cure. But the scars on the land remained. If you walk through the old cemeteries of the Northeast today, you will find graves that tell a silent story of the panic. You will find stones where the dates of death for 4 or 5 siblings occur within months of each other. You will find the vampire folk of the Jewett City Ray family, whose bones were rearranged in a desperate attempt to stop the dying. These are not just historical curiosities. They are monuments to a time when the human mind was forced to invent monsters to make sense of a reality that was too cruel to bear. The Great New England Vampire Panic was the last gasp of an ancient way of seeing the world. It was the final time that a modern, Western society officially sanctioned the hunting of the undead. When the microscope finally revealed the ghost, the horror did not vanish. It simply changed shape. We stopped fearing the shadow in the graveyard and started fearing the invisible world all around us. We traded the stake for the syringe and the ritual for the prescription. But as we look back at the scorched remains of Mercy Brown's heart, we must ask ourselves, have we truly escaped the darkness? Or have we merely given our demons new names? We stand now at the edge of the 19th century, looking back through the mist at the men with shovels and the women with blood-stained handkerchiefs. We often treat the New England vampire panic as a dark comedy of errors, a bizarre footnote in the annals of American history where ignorant farmers behaved like characters in a Gothic novel. We mock their superstition and marvel at their grisly rituals. But to do so is to miss the most profound and terrifying revelation of the entire saga. The final thesis of this history is not that our ancestors were foolish, but that they were profoundly, devastatingly human. The vampire was never a creature of the night. It was a manifestation of the most powerful force in the human experience, the refusal to let go. These men did not dig up their daughters because they hated them or because they feared them. They dug them up because they loved their sons more than they respected the silence of the grave. The true horror of the New England vampire panic wasn't the exhumation of the dead, it was the desperation of the living. It was the sight of a father, broken by grief, trying to perform surgery on the wind. It was the realization that when we are faced with an invisible, unstoppable enemy, we will create a monster just so we have something to fight. We would rather live in a world of vampires than in a world of cold, indifferent accidents. Today, we have mapped the genome of the bacterium. We have conquered the wasting death with antibiotics and public health. We no longer burn hearts on flat rocks to save our children. And yet, the impulse remains. In the face of modern plagues and unseen threats, we still look for a villain to blame. We still seek out the spectral parasite that is draining our vitality. We still reach for the ancient tools of exclusion and fear when science fails to give us an immediate answer. Mercy Brown was not a vampire. She was a 19-year-old girl who died too young in a cold, lonely place. But in her death, she became a mirror. When the men of Exeter looked into her casket, they didn't see a monster. They saw their own reflection, twisted by terror and sharpened by the need to survive. The vampire is not a creature that haunts the cemetery. It is a creature that lives in the gap between what we know and what we fear. And as long as that gap exists, as long as there is a shadow we cannot explain, the shovel will always be waiting by the door.